this is Kyle, also known as Alientude, reviewing today this Type 10 sword made by Eric Estlund of Winter Cutlery. This is the last of the 3 swords that Eric sent me as loaners to review. And I saved this one for last because it's probably the one that I am going to be least familiar with. I'm much more comfortable with long swords than arming swords. This is a hell of an arming sword too. It's big, it's broad, and it's a beast. That's right up front. You can probably tell just by looking at it. Now this sword and the scabbard that it comes with are available on Winter Cutlery's website for the asking price of $3,000. This is one of Eric's older works, so he prices it a little bit lower according to what he considers to be a fair price. And the scabbard that it comes with is relatively simple here. It's got an oxblood die. It's got this very long kind of leather chape on it, which is something I haven't seen before, but Eric did show me some artwork that seems to indicate this was actually, if not, maybe not common, maybe it might have been common, but it was definitely seen in the period. And it's kind of interesting because, like I said, I don't think I've ever seen this on a modern reproduction before, so it's kind of cool that to have something different that is still historical. Overall, the scabbard, just like Eric's other ones, is outstanding. I'm not going to belabor this point, but if you're interested, check out the review I did on the Salzritter 2 weeks ago because I talked about his leather work, his scabbard work a lot more. Just suffice to say, the fit here is outstanding. The draw is beautiful. Everything about the scabbard I absolutely love. So taking a look at the hilt, we have a Type B pommel, which is very characteristic for Norman-style swords. One thing that's really interesting about this pommel that is almost invisible to the eye unless you know to look for it is that it is slightly asymmetrical, and that is intentional. There are a lot of examples of asymmetrical pommels in the historical record, and Eric wanted to mimic that. If you look, this side is slightly shorter than this side. And what this actually ends up doing is creating something of a true edge and false edge, because by putting the slightly shorter side against the palm, it works a little bit better as a right-handed user. If it was a left-handed user, you'd switch it around. But if I put the slightly longer one there, it still works, but it's slightly different, and it makes for a lot of nuance in how you're handling the sword. And it's really kind of cool, especially because you don't really see that unless you're actually looking for it. The finish on the pommel is a satin, not really particularly bright and shiny. There's some patina on it, but it looks overall very well crafted. The peen on here is nearly invisible. I can barely see it at all. These corners here are all chamfered over and smoothed over very nicely. They're crisp, but they're not sharp, although it is still very easy for them to bite into your hand if you're not gripping the sword the way the sword wants to be gripped. I can find 2 ways to use this sword, and I'll talk about that a little bit more during the handling section. If we look at the grip, it's a very simple one with a riser on either end, a cord texture, and just a little bit of swell here and then tapering here, and just a general taper right there. It gives me a very solid grip. This sword's not going anywhere when I'm gripping it how I want to grip it. So the grip is very effective. The crossguard is a Type 1, which is a very simple crossguard that has a little bit more nuance than it might look just by looking at the profile. Because if you look here, you can see it does actually taper it towards the thickness of the crossguard tapers towards the quill and tips. But overall, it's quite simple. The finish here is just like the pommel, and the fit of the blade to the crossguard is excellent. There's pretty much no way it could be improved without shaping it to meet the fuller, which I'm not really aware of anybody who does that on this type of sword. I could be wrong, but I don't recall having seen it before. Moving on to the blade itself, I have not been able to do my normal measurements here, but I'll take a couple quick measurements on the fly just so we can get an idea. It is 2 pounds, 9 ounces exactly in weight, And let's take a look at what the thickness is, if I can get my calipers to work. So it starts at 4.3 millimeters thick, about halfway up the blade. It looks like it's about 3.5 out here towards the tip. Out here towards the tip, we are down to, my calipers are dying. The battery in them is dying. 1 second. Let's try that again. Yeah, my caliper battery just died, so I won't be able to say what the thickness out towards the tip is, but it is overall a relatively thin blade. It doesn't start particularly thin. It does definitely have some taper, but not a ton. You can see it doesn't have a ton of flex, which this type of sword oftentimes will have a decent amount of flex. And as for the point of balance, you can see it's pretty far out. This is a big, powerful blade with a point of balance that's conducive for chopping. That looks to me like it's about 6 inches, right around there. I can actually use my finger mark on there to probably measure it. That looks like actually closer to 7 inches than 6 inches. So quite a far out point of balance. And this sword feels it. We'll talk about that in a moment here. The finish on the blade is a satin, a little bit duller than some of the other swords that Eric sent me. You can see the maker's mark right here. The edge beveling is excellent. There is a small, what I would consider micro bevel. It's not a secondary bevel. It's blended in there, but the polish is a little bit different so you can see it. But it's blended in very nicely and apple seeded. And it's also very sharp. If we look down the lengths, there is definitely some very surface level rippling, and the fuller kind of wobbles around a little bit here and there. Like I mentioned, this is one of Eric's earlier swords. So some of the little details and fit and finish might be a little bit rougher than what you would see if you ordered something from him now. And that is probably why the price is lower than his current, more recent work. The fuller termination is a little bit wobbly as well, but these are very minor details, at least to me. The tip is pretty symmetrical, not perfect, but pretty close. And overall, this broad blade with the broad fuller, long fuller, it just screams early medieval powerful sword. So let's move on to cutting with this sword. Now, like I said earlier, arming swords aren't quite up my alley as much as long swords, and especially earlier medieval powerful heavy swords like this are definitely outside my comfort zone. I mostly used a hammer grip and did chopping attacks with this, and let me tell you, this sword cuts whatever is put in front of it with ease. I was able to get very clean cuts on light targets and heavier targets without putting much effort. You don't need to swing this sword hard to get through a target. The sword is doing that swinging for you. It's pulling your cut through and delivering the power based on the point of balance, the weight, all that. It is doing a lot of work for me, and the edge is quite sharp, so it is able to cut and not just impact hard. It cuts very, very well. And I also got a little bit of work on tatami with this sword. I took it to the Valley of the Sun cutting competition. I had some ideas about maybe recording this review in the hotel room, but I was exhausted after every day, so I never had time. And the recording of this review is a little bit rushed because of the timing of Valley of the Sun. But regardless, after the tournament, there was some free cutting, and I wanted to get a little bit with this sword in, because after I saw how well it cut in the backyard, I wanted to put it against tatami, and it did not disappoint. Once again, very little power in the cuts, and the sword sang through the tatami, no problem. I barely even felt it touch the tatami. It just went right through, super easy cut. Now, I would never want to do any kind of anything other than descending cuts with this, basically. Maybe I could see myself doing ascending, but when you're doing ascending, suddenly you're fighting the sword's extra weight rather than letting the sword pull the cut down. So it's going to be harder to accelerate the sword, and it's not going to be as easy to get good cuts. In addition, my ascending cuts with arming swords suck anyways, so I wasn't going to do that. I just did a couple descending cuts with this. I marveled at how well it cut tatami, and then I moved on. So moving on to how this sword handles. Like I said earlier, I can think of basically two ways to use the sword. One of them is the way I pretty much used it, which was hammer grip and do more chops. Don't try to accelerate the tip, just chop the sword through things. I'll talk about why I think that's an effective technique in a little bit. But the other way, and this is something that Philip Martin had a class at Valley of the Sun, and it really helped crystallize my thoughts on this, is instead of doing a hammer grip, just slightly alter it, have the pommel rest against the palm there, and you can then accelerate the tip a bit more and let the pommel rest against the palm and not bite into your hand at all, and you're using your palm to keep edge alignment. Now, I didn't use it like that because with a point of balance that's already pretty far out, it starts getting pretty uncomfortable. And this is something you've done a lot with a sword of this magnitude. So I didn't try that out, but just that little quick technique I was doing there, I can definitely see how that works and would definitely work with this sword. And I think that would be the way to use it a little bit more like what many people do with later medieval swords. Whereas with this one, you don't really want to flick the tip out there. The sword's not nimble enough in my hands at least to want to flick the tip out and to use the sword as your defense mechanism. What you would use as a defense mechanism is a shield. I would think on foot you would have a shield. This would be your defense, and you wouldn't be worrying about using the sword to defend you. You would be blocking, cutting down low, blocking, cutting at the head and shoulders, that kind of thing. Thrusts behind a shield the entire time because this sword does not want to recover quickly and change directions quickly and anything like that. It is a chonker, frankly, but not in a bad way. It's heavy and it's got a point of balance that's far out, but it's very intentional. And besides using a shield, the other big use I can think of for this would be mounted combat. I could easily see a knight on a horse just riding along and chopping into peasants. Chopping. You know, you're not worrying about delivering speed. The horse is delivering the speed. You're just chopping down on the unfortunate peasants that have almost no defense against this beastly sword coming at them from above. So I think that personally is the primary use of a sword like this, would be mounted combat against unmounted combatants. But you could certainly use it on foot if you had a shield. So it's got a lot of purpose. This sword, just picking it up, it's pretty intuitive actually on how to use it, because I can't at least worry about flicking the tip out there. It just doesn't work for me like that. So it's intuitive that this is more of a chopper and a powerful blow deliverer rather than a nimble dueling sword, or a sword that you're going to probe your enemy's defenses, try to find a spot. No, you're not going to do that. You're just going to chop with power. So this sword and scabbard are available on Winter Cutlery's website for $3,000. Is it worth that price? Yes. Even though this sword is not for me, it is absolutely worth that price. So let's compare this to an Albion, and specifically let's talk about the museum line, because that's a bit more of a fair comparison than the next generation line, which are not quite as historical as the museum line, or with as much research as Eric puts in this sword and his work. You can get at the museum line The Wallace is around 1600 if I remember right. The St. Maurice is at 2100, somewhere around there. And then that's just the sword, and there's also at least a 2-year wait. But if you include the scabbard that comes with this, that jumps the price up $600, $700, something like that. And this, you're getting a sword that has a little bit more individuality to it. Whereas the Albion Museum line is more of a production series of swords. That's not a bad thing. Albion does fantastic work. But when you're looking at a custom maker's work, you get a little bit more individuality, a little more personality. I would not buy the sword for $3,000. But that's because this is not my type of sword. If this was one of my types of swords, I would think it would be an absolute steal for me. So yeah, this is absolutely worth it. It is a hell of a cutter. It has all sorts of intent behind it. The sword acts like the way it wants to, the way it should act, and it really handles the way I expect the sword to handle, just looking at how big and beefy it is. So absolutely, I think it's worth it. Now, not everybody thinks individual custom makers are worth the price they ask for, and that's fine. Everybody has different goals of their collecting budget, their collecting goals. Everybody's different. If you happen to like collecting from individual makers who will tailor their project to your desire, do a lot of research into the project, I highly recommend checking Eric out. And that's going to wrap up this review and all of the winter cutlery reviews. I want to say an absolute enormous thank you to Eric for sending me 3 swords to review. It has been an absolute pleasure and privilege to handle and use these swords and review them. So thank you, Eric. Greatly appreciate it. Everybody else, make sure you hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't, check out wintercutlery.com. Until next time, Alien Toot out.